We all like ancient Egypt, don't we? Even if it isn't your favorite bit of history, it's a good connecting point for something you probably do like. If you're interested in Rome or Greece, Egypt is pretty damn relevant to those places. If you go even further back in history, you get stuff like studying the archaeology of Egypt, as in studying ancient Egyptian archaeologists who themselves were dedicated to studying even ancienter Egypt. It's that old. It's fun to imagine what it was like to live in ancient Egypt, looking at the Sphinx and the pyramids towering over the landscape when they were in their prime. But you know what I find even more interesting? The image of those same titanic structures coming to life. Skeletal legions pouring out of the pyramids to bring the living to heal in the name of their undying overlords. Ancient chariots, once used to run down their rivals, now being turned on those who came after them as they reclaim the lands they ruled thousands of years ago. Ancient Egypt is cool, and ancient Egypt rising from the sand to rule once again is even cooler, and such was the philosophy that gave us the Tomb Kings. Sometimes total originality is overrated, because sure, gods with names like Petra and walking sphinxes have some pretty clear inspiration, but can you really deny that it's awesome nonetheless? So let me ask you this. Do you like ancient Egypt? Does your ego demand that those around you kneel before their betters? You, of course? Does the idea of someone stealing from you drive you to rage never before seen by even the most hardened Kornate berserker? Then there's only one army for you, my friend. The Tomb Kings of Nehekhara. But while the Tomb Kings don't have to worry about what's for dinner today, you do. After all, you aren't a skeleton. And if you need some help on that front, you can do no better than Factor, the sponsor of this video. Factor makes and ships chef-crafted and dietitian-approved meals right to your front door. Making food can be a hassle sometimes in this day and age. Maybe you've had a long extended shift at work and don't really have time or energy to cook when you get home. Maybe it's your day off work, but it's loaded with so many appointments and errands you don't have time to squeeze in cooking still. Whatever the case, Factor has your back. No grocery store trips, no prep time or cleaning the stove to be done. Just pop it in the microwave for 2 minutes and you have a meal ready to go. But good dinner food made quickly isn't all they have. They have breakfast, some small bites for a snack, and I particularly like the smoothies they have. And of course, the most important things when it comes to food are the health and the taste. Factor meals are, as I said, dietitian approved, so that first thing is covered, and here you can see me chowing down. I can assure you from first-hand experience that Factor's food is quite delicious. And just to sweeten things up for you a little bit, here's a deal from me to you. Head to Factor75.com or click the link below and use code 50Pancreas to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That's code 50Pancreas at Factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. Eating shouldn't be a stressful thing, so order some Factor today and make the experience all the easier for you to enjoy. Now then, say it with me, everyone.
We do not serve. We rule.
The Tomb Kings, as is fitting for the ancient Egypt faction, did not start their lives out as mummies. They were once a highly prosperous civilization that rivaled and in some ways arguably surpassed even the elves and the dwarfs. In fact, given that Warhammer fantasy varies from loosely paralleling to outright ripping off real-world history, there's a decent shot that the first humans created by the old ones became the Tomb Kings. That's pure conjecture though, take it with a grain of salt. The earliest myths of the Tomb Kings tell of how they and their gods fought against demons that had plagued the land, almost certainly correlating with the time of the Great Catastrophe when chaos first entered the world. While the elves and the lizardmen were summoning the vortex and preventing chaos from being able to show up wherever, the Nehekharans and their pantheon seem to have given a good showing of things themselves. They drove chaos off from their lands and their gods rewarded them by turning Nehekhara into a lush and verdant land. From there, the culture would develop to, of course, mirror ancient Egypt, although of course with some fantastical twists. The extent of ancient Egypt's obsession with death is something that's become rather debated. For the ancient Tomb Kings, who in life were called the Priest Kings, but I'm going to keep calling them Tomb Kings anyways, there is no debating the obsession with death. It all began with a man named Setra. Nehekhara, like any other nation, goes through ups and downs. During one of these down periods, lizardmen had sacked at least one of their cities, barbarians of both human and orc variety plagued the land, and disease, famine, and more racked the proud kingdom. None of the various city-states were willing to lower their guard and work with one another, however, and so things were looking bleak. Then a man named Setra the Imperishable showed up and started cracking heads left, right, and center. Already an accomplished warrior through his many battles alongside his father's forces, Setra was a ruthless, brutal tyrant who brooked no nonsense from his subjects. At the same time, he remembered you want to have both love and fear to be the ultimate king. So when Settra took, he also gave. For example, if you said no to Settra's demands to become his subject or any of his demands in general, you were erased from the planet. There would be no memory of you by the time he was done, because he heard about the Romans salting Carthage and thought it was too tame a punishment. On the other hand, he would do all the good empire building stuff you do in any strategy game ever, to of course bolster his kingdom's wealth, but also to make the lives of everyone in it better. Temples, more agricultural development, all the good stuff that makes life a bit easier for your average peasant. He was so goddamn committed to his country that in order to solve the drought that was raging at the time, he sacrificed all of his children to the gods. Feel free to debate the morality of that one, but you can't deny the effectiveness because the very next day the rivers flooded and the drought ended. Under his rule, the Tomb Kings conquered as far away as Lustria, which for reference as to how insane that is, imagine seeing an Egyptian-style pyramid in Chile. Covenants with the gods were made, the land flourished, and under his iron grip, Nehekhara went through its golden age. Age, however, was the singular enemy he couldn't defeat, and so he created the institution that would help bring about some of Nehekhara's greatest strength, but also its downfall, the mortuary cult. He bade them to find the secret to eternal life, which they couldn't quite manage during his lifetime. Furious, but forced to accept he couldn't fistfight his telomeres for the sin of causing him to get older, he instead ordered the construction of a massive pyramid for him and his loyal servants to be entombed in. All the while, the mortuary cult was to work on eternal life, as well as resurrecting the dead with golden bodies, so Settra could live once more with the full splendor he deserved. With this, they became the stereotype of ancient Egypt we so love, although they're not undead yet. Successive kings would follow the practice of creating massive pyramids for them and their subjects to be buried in, though none would ever build a taller one than Settra, out of both genuine respect for the great king and fear he would rise from the dead at the sheer audacity of whoever built one bigger than his. They would become obsessed with death, wanting to not only prepare their souls for the afterlife, but their bodies for the promised resurrection of the mortuary cult. Every building got a skull, every pyramid was covered in imagery of the god of the dead. Death was in fashion, and everyone was here for it. Maybe not the guys who were buried in the pyramids alongside their lord while they were still alive, but everyone else was all about the afterlife. The Tomb Kings would then proceed to have those periods of ups and downs, as I said, as all nations do. The mortuary cult would advance and discover new magics and discoveries as history progressed, eventually finding a sort of immortality. Unfortunately, it was less eternal youth and more keeping your soul bound in your mummified body, but hey, that's progress. Unfortunately, and if you know what comes next, you know how just big of an unfortunately this is going to turn out to be, there was a quirk in regards to who's sent to join the mortuary cult. It had become tradition in Nehekhara that instead of the firstborn child inheriting the throne, it was the secondborn. The firstborn was instead sent to join the mortuary cult. The secondborn who would become king of Khemri at the time was a fella named Thutep. Certainly no Settra, but the worst thing that might have happened was Nehekhara goes through some small downturns and Khemri, the greatest city, loses some prestige. The problem is, his older brother was a man named Nagash, and Nagash was a very bad egg. Nagash coveted power. He was once in charge of a military operation after the dude in charge was indisposed of, and his name was entirely removed from the history books and reports. He despaired that in the great lands of Nehekhara, the second-born became king, while in the barbarous lands around them, it was always the first who became ruler. Despite his rapid rise through the ranks of the mortuary cult on account of his royal blood and raw talent, it would never be enough to satisfy him. But then, something wonderful happened. For him. Wonderful for him, awful for everyone else. Some captured Dark Elves were scheduled for sacrifice as a part of a trade between Khemri and another city, and as a member of the mortuary cult, he said not to worry everyone, he would take care of the 3 elves. He smuggled them away to a pyramid, told them to teach him proper magic or they'd die, and then when they finally tried to escape, he beat all of them in a magical duel. Nagash would then invent necromancy, overthrow his brother, begin a reign of terror as he gave out elixirs of eternal life and necromantic knowledge to anyone who'd bend the knee, and when he was finally kicked out by 7 entire other city-states armies, he just said nuh-uh to their efforts. As the inventor of necromancy, death stopped being much of an impediment. So he wandered off, died, possessed his own corpse, gathered his strength, fought some rats and ate the magical crack rocks they had on them, discovered even more about magic than he already knew, and eventually found out someone had copied his cliff notes and used them to make vampires in a lesser imitation of his eternal life elixir. Vampires being undead, he immediately brought them under his control and made them his undead generals alongside his second-in-command Arkan the Black. Nagash would once again attack Nehekhara, this time with far more brutal tactics. You've got the Not Nile River, dump so many corpses in it that it's permanently tainted. Farmland? I think you mean barren wasteland. Monuments to the gods? Well, by killing his brother's wife when he first took power, he broke a covenant with the gods so they no longer helped Nehekhara out much anymore, but burned those down too, why not? The ruling king at the time, Alcadizar, was an amazing king and managed to push him back in some critical victories, but after another brief timeout on Nagash's part, he realized the move was not to act like a conqueror, but instead like an evil lich. He doubled down on the atrocities and crafted the ultimate spell, one that would leave Nehekhara barren of all life, and the corpses that came about from this brought under his control permanently. And for once in the history of evil schemes to kill everyone, it worked. Mostly. With the exception of Alcadizar, who was the focal point of the spell, everything in Nehekhara died. No strings attached, they just died. With the help of the Skaven of all people, Alcadizar was able to defeat Nagash and prevent him from raising an endless army of the dead under his command, but the damage was already done. Nagash's victory was prevented, but his nation was gone. He wandered off and died shortly thereafter, as far as he knew, the last survivor of Nehekhara. Except about the land being gone. Turns out, the spell still took partial effect. Though not under Nagash's control, the dead around Nehekhara began awakening en masse. For some, it was almost instant. One second they were fighting Nagash's legions, the next they were looking around wondering why their heart wasn't beating, but they weren't dying. Others were far more ancient beings from the time of Cetra, mummified kings who were probably a bit miffed the whole golden penis thing the mortuary cult promised wasn't what they woke up to. Across the now entirely desert landscape did the dead awaken, and after a short while only one question remained. Who the hell was in charge now? Dynastic politics are a messy thing, even in our own world, and out of everything you can say about the Habsburgs, they at least never rose up from the dead to reclaim their throne. Hearts of Iron IV notwithstanding. But in Nehekhara, that's exactly what happened. Every single Tomb King who arose from the dead wanted their throne back, and unlike the noble squabbles of real life, each of them had a 100% valid claim to the throne because they were the king or queen at one point. There was no I deserve to be king because they just said I was king. So great-great-grandpa argued with his daughter, great-grandma argued with her adopted son, grandpa argued with dad who might have been an elf but no one was ever sure, and he argues with you. Even with this second chance, it seemed the Tomb Kings would tear themselves apart. Until the head of the mortuary cult Katep had an idea. Cetra's pyramid throughout this lay dormant still, the magical wards around it both normal and constructed with divine intervention, too powerful for even Nagash's magic to penetrate. In his time, Cetra had once saved Nehekhara from the disaster it faced. Surely he could do so again. And so Cetra was awoken. Katep began informing him of Nehekhara's history since his death, and Cetra kept getting angrier and angrier. Because Katep had awoken him before the mortuary cult could figure out how to give the mummified Cetra his living golden body, but since it was also a very desperate situation, Cetra held off from killing him outright, and instead banished him to find a way to restore the Tomb Kings to proper life. In the meantime, Cetra set about making everyone else behave. Though dead longer than perhaps anyone else, Cetra was still the imperishable. Immediate demands to submit to him were issued wherever he went, which was followed surprisingly often because everyone was rightfully afraid of the guy. Some, such as Queen Khalida, submitted less out of fear and more out of the fact that all she really cares about is killing vampires for personal reasons, and Cetra was convinced to let her keep doing that. Anyone who outright fought him was once again promptly defeated, and their unliving skulls used as catapult ammunition to throw at the next person who refused to bend the knee. From there, Cetra set out a few rules. Rule number 1, keep the infighting to a minimum. Not 0, pointedly, because he knows that the Tomb Kings are all egotistical bastards, but try and keep the mass destruction down when possible as you fight your family for who's in charge. Rule number 2, when Cetra calls, you damn well better answer. That one's a lot less negotiable, but it is pretty easy to follow. And rule 3, rebuild. Though not in the way they wanted, the dead Tomb Kings were back to life, and the world would once again know the wrath of the kings of Nehekhara. And if you choose them as your army, you too can spread their glory across the old world. Before we start the pros and cons, here's a bit of bias I have to get out of the way before we start looking at the army. Here's a map of the Empire of Man in Total War. You can see my man Karl Franz is Emperor. For as long as he lives, assuming the end times doesn't happen, that is how long the entire world doesn't belong to Cetra. Franz is still my number 1 after all, but as a faction, I'm appreciating the Tomb Kings more and more. Aside from however long his lifespan is, the entire world belongs to the Tomb Kings in all other periods of time. With the attitude I'm going to be analyzing their lore with now firmly established, let's get to work. The first one is that the Tomb Kings give you room for literally any kind of narrative you could possibly want for your army. Are you one of them under the command of Cetra? Are you a rebellious lord looking to strike out on your own despite the consequences? Both are perfectly valid, but that's just scratching the surface. The Tomb Kings as a whole can be classified as true neutral, not because they're mindless undead, or at least their leaders aren't, but because a Tomb King and their army can be found fighting for any ideal or purpose you can think of. Maybe they're heroic defenders against chaos, greenskins, and more, fighting them off either to help defend the living or just because their cruelty pisses them off. Maybe they just want to be left alone and only fight because the Warhammer world has plenty of people that won't leave them alone. Maybe they're evil to the core and are hellbent on conquering everything. Or maybe they're genuinely good people but are so egotistical and full of themselves they're convinced only they can rule well, and so they're hellbent on conquering everything in the name of peace and prosperity. If there's a possible motivation to be fighting in a wargame, your army can have it. They can be genuinely good, completely evil, and everything in between. Have your Tomb King not even realize he's dead, go full Nemesaur Zandrek. Although if we're being honest here, Nemesaur Zandrek and every other Necron special character nowadays are going full Tomb King. One of those two factions came first, and it wasn't the ones in space. As a follow-up to that one though, being terrifying undead beings who know nothing but hatred for all life is also perfectly possible if you want to loop back around to your army's character being that of lacking any individual character. Plenty of Tomb Kings are no doubt jealous of those who still have things like a heartbeat and skin, and so vengeance can and should be wrought upon them. Or they've been driven so insane by their cursed existence that there's nothing left, just a desire to lash out at those around them. And most of your army are not Tomb Kings with personality. They're skeletons that have the barest memory of what they did in life and the sense to follow their leader's orders. This attitude is by no means necessary. Khalida is perfectly happy to work with the living, and Cetra only cares that you serve. But if you want mindless undead, by no means would you be breaking canon by having your army fluffed around that. On that topic though, the Tomb Kings are perfect for those of you who want an endless army. They just respawn. The mortuary cult can resurrect the dead, from other Tomb Kings down to your standard soldier, and the most powerful kings like Cetra seem to just come back out of sheer willpower. Now granted, he might be an exception in that field, because he's also a wizard for no other reason than other people were able to do something he couldn't, and that's not allowed at all, so he just willed himself to become one. But the point is that the Tomb Kings are a never-ending tide of undeath to swallow your enemies with if you'd like them to be. There's a battle between two Tomb Kings armies that have been raging since before they became undead because they were cursed by the gods to never stop. Ever since Nagash did his thing, that's everyone in the country. There's enough dead in Nehekara to sustain a near-infinite army, and unless you grind both the Lich Priest resurrecting everyone and the entire army of skeletons to dust, there will always be more to throw into the fight. At least in the lore, we'll come back to that for tabletop. Tomb Kings also tend to make themselves the most important person around at any given moment, and are at the largest of scale battles more often than not. That's not to say there are no smaller scale things present. Khalida does have her secret agents in her quest to kill every vampire ever, Neferata in particular. But by and large, they're a bombastic sort, even if they're not super into conquest. A king, after all, should make his presence known. Why get the job done with 10 skeletons when you can use 1,000 and a sphinx? Why have a small ceremony to mark your birthday when you could invite imperial nobles from across the world and brag to them about how shapely the hip bones of your concubines are? The last bit of that sentence isn't me making something up. A Tomb King character in a Gotrek and Felix book bragged about exactly that. If you want to be the center of attention, there's no better army for you right now than these guys. That ego thing is a positive all to itself, though. The Tomb Kings are almost all so arrogant they cannot conceive of Nehekara as anything but the best thing ever. Cetra is so full of himself, his willpower forces slain soldiers to rise back up, because this man's ego shines with the force of a star. Do you think even the arrogance of the elves can match his? He's Cetra. That's damn near an exact quote of the man. He knows what he's about. It can be a nice change of pace from the grim acceptance of being outmatched a lot of other Warhammer armies might feel during combat. It doesn't matter if they're outgunned, outnumbered, and out-whatevered. They are a Tomb King, and you are not, so victory is automatically assured. A small positive, but if you want nothing more than for people to get the hell off your lawn because you're a cranky old man in body and or spirit, this army is all you. Look at their Total War trailer. They weren't doing anything till the Dark Elves started poking around their stuff. Sometimes you have those moods where you just want everyone around you to go away, and if that's you all the time, there's no better force than the Tomb Kings for you. Bonus points if you've ever complained about how back in your day, things were better. The obvious next pro, of course, is if you like ancient Egypt, they're good for you, but for a bit more of an in-depth look at the Tomb Kings, they're perfect for an army with a lot of visual and mechanical variety, at least from unit to unit. Skeleton warriors and archers are of course just fellas without skin, but who doesn't love a good skeleton army? Same largely for the Tomb Guard, albeit they're skeletons with a bit more flair to them. But because the Tomb Kings are an army of animated undead and constructs combined with ancient Egypt, it goes well beyond just being dudes walking around the battlefield. Ushabti are towering constructs to rip into the enemy, chariots stand proud as they commit vehicular manslaughter, and of course the various constructs of the army are spectacular to behold on the battlefield. That's not even close to all the stuff available either, like the man made out of bugs, which is an option you can play. To bring this partway back to lore, since I realized this started veering into tabletop positives a bit early, it means the models you field can easily represent your king's personality in a war. Does your king like swarm tactics? Double down on the infantry. 100 skeleton warriors are quite hard to kill. Are they a brash leader who often rushes in without thinking? You have both normal cavalry and chariots to run your enemy down with. Are they a simpler person who just want big smashy monsters under their control? Ushabti aren't even that big compared to the real heavy hitters, but they still tower well above the poor Bretonnian peasant you're throwing them at even before the Sphinx starts walking. And the last lore positive which stands out to me is that the Tomb Kings are something pretty much exactly the same as they were in old fantasy days. Now to skip ahead, this leads to the exact downside you can think of. There's not going to be much new with this army, but for one of the two armies that launched the old world, I think that's fine. Don't rock the boat too much. Give us some old fantasy goodness with some new models. And with the Tomb Kings, it does make perfect sense. As undead who are pretty set in their ways, there's only so much they'd change as a faction in the few hundred years between old world and modern fantasy. And to put it in a sappier perspective, much like their leader, the Tomb Kings show that Warhammer Fantasy, even after it got blown up, is truly imperishable. Now for pure tabletop positives. I will apologize in advance because unlike AOS and 40k, there's no Wahapedia for Old World. So I do ask that you take my word when I say I'm looking at the Tomb King army rules and arcane journal and not just lying to you about what I'm talking about. Let's start with arguably the central part of your army for a standard Grand Host composition: skeleton warriors and archers. These things are dirt cheap. Before we get into any sort of upgrades for them, the standard skeleton warrior rocks in with a point cost of 4 per model. 4 points a model, with a standard weapon and shield coming with. If you really want to ball out and flex the ancient wealth, you can give them light armor and spears for a whopping 6 points a model, each of those upgrades being an additional 1 point per model each. If you want disposable infantry, you cannot possibly get any better than this. The archers, meanwhile, are 5 points a model base, but you get ranged attacks, and when you give them light armor, it comes out to the same 6 points total. As with all things, point costs are subject to change, but in any case, Tomb King's basic infantry are going to be cheap no matter what. Even Tomb Guard are only 10 points a model and come with light armor right out the gate. Other core choices aren't horrid either, depending on your needs. The Tomb King's skeleton cavalry aren't exactly the best in the game, but they do have 8 inches of movement to harass an opponent's archers with. Alternatively, make them horse archers. They aren't phenomenal, but archers with 8 inches of movement means they can get where they need to be, and can also avoid the issue of not having enough movement left to wheel them into proper position. And I assure you, you do not want to deal with that sort of bullshit. But the anvil must have a hammer, and you have so many to choose from. Necropolis Knights can be a brutal thing, being monstrous cavalry with impact hits, even if only 1 per model. Impact hits, for those unaware, means that when you charge, you get a hit, as many as the number next to the impact hits keyword, which for certain units that are coming up can be devastating. Looking at their stat sheet is throwing a million different rules at you, so to sum up, they can hit hard and the mount has poisoned attacks for a bit more reliability, they get a better save from their armored hide, they can guarantee wounds on certain model types with cleaving blow, and they're decently tough with 3 wounds and toughness 4. Sepulchral Stalkers wound against the target's initiative instead of toughness, and with their tails they can get D3 extra attacks per model. Ushabti are monstrous infantry that can rip apart a unit of basic infantry or tear into even some heavier models with their great bows if you choose to arm them with such. The great bows are a free upgrade, so choosing either melee or range is entirely a matter of personal preference for you. And I haven't even gotten to the various monstrous constructs that they have. Tomb Scorpions can be a proper menace against units with low initiative if your army is a mortuary cult's army. By paying 5 points for ambushers and 2 points for the terrors below, this thing can force enemy units it appears next to, using from beneath the sands, to make an initiative test. They make as many tests as their total unit strength adds up to, and for each failure, a model is removed from play. Necrolith Colossi can theoretically destroy anything in the game in a single round, because if it charged, then during combat, every unsaved wound it causes gives it another attack. This rule applies to attacks gained this way too, so if some poor bastard decides to tie it up with spearmen or ungors, you can quickly show them why that's a horrible idea. The Bone Dragon is a great way to keep a character alive, and it can cause some real ruckus even ignoring that, between its breath weapon and mighty dragon claws. Turns out it has weapon skill 4, not 2. Please remember this and do not use the weapon skill of the Lich Priest on top of it for the Dragon's Claw attacks like I did. That will make you feel very silly. A war sphinx is a sphinx that's about as tough and strong as you'd expect the sphinx to be if it stood up and started hitting people, and you can put some fellas on top of it to get some pot shots and extra melee damage. By the way, did you know the Necrosphinx can fly? Because I'm looking at the Tomb King's rules as I write this, and there it is, Fly 9. It's a brutal thing, as it should be for just shy of 200 points, or 200 points exactly, if you take the Envenom Sting for a poison attack per turn. You can also pick a single character per game to give the Necrosphinx free rerolls of 1s to hit against them, because it has determined you are dead, and it will be giving Usirian his due no matter what the enemy might think about that. Now all that is well and good, but we still haven't discussed what to me is the true beauty of the Tomb Kings as an army. Chariot spam. Chariots in fantasy are a wonderful thing. In terms of effectiveness on the charge, they're somewhere in between a stampede of elephants and a second gyrocopter hitting the Everpeak. And you know what the Tomb Kings can do that to my knowledge no one else can? You can take them in units rather than singular models. This means that in terms of their effectiveness, a Tomb King's chariot charge is somewhere between a GTA drive-by and the rumbling. D3 impact hits a model, but this time spread out across several models makes for a very dead infantry line. It can even chew into some heavier units with some lucky rolls. At toughness 3 and 3 wounds a pop, they're durable enough, and if you charge them into weaker units, you don't have to worry about a thing. The damage of the dudes riding the chariot isn't phenomenal, but it's all about the charge here, and they do that just fine. At 43 points a pop before things like the standard bearer are included, they're absolutely worth getting. The best thing is that they're a core choice too. Just grab 10 skeleton warriors and fill the rest of your list with chariots if you so choose. Sure, you won't have the most sustainable of armies, but if you run everyone down on the second turn, that's not gonna matter. For extra fun, use a royal host army composition so that they're not only still core, they're the required core choice instead of skeleton warriors. And for two last things worth mentioning, Carrion and Tomb Swarms. Carrion are undead vultures that can go harass some archers, artillery, or lone heroes, and Tomb Swarms sure are a swarm. Put them in the path of something important to the enemy, and if they get some healing, ensure that enemy unit remains stuck fighting them until the heat death of our actual real-world universe. As for characters, there's good stuff there too, don't you worry. Starting small, Necrotechs can for a successful leadership test give a unit they join not only an extra attack, but also hatred against all enemies until your next start of turn subphase. Not the most flashy of abilities, but certainly welcome, though at only Leadership 7, it's not a guaranteed ability pop by any means. Royal Heralds help with Unstable, always a good thing to see in an undead army, and can eat some wounds for a Monarch if they're nearby. The Monarch, speaking of, the Tomb Kings and Princes themselves, are something to behold. A Tomb King's stats are great, while a Tomb Prince for the most part is the same thing, but a point worse in almost every area. Still decent, and obviously cheaper for the downgrade. They can hit damn hard, and with a leadership value of 10 for a King and 9 for a Prince, worrying about morale is a thing of the past, even ignoring the fact your troops are physically incapable of fear. Their special feature is My Will Be Done, and for a leadership test, you can give themselves and any unit they join either +1 to their weapon skill, D3 extra inches of movement, or D3 extra points to their initiative. All of these can be great if used correctly, so look at the situation and decide what you need going forward. Lich Priests, meanwhile, are wizards. You need at least one to be your army's Hierophant, and they know spells from either Elementalism, Illusion, or Necromancy. They can also choose to discard one of the randomly rolled spells, as well as swapping out that lore signature spell in exchange for one of 3 spells from the lore of Nehekara. These can let you either debuff an enemy's strength and toughness, give a unit or potentially all units in range reserve movement to help them get where they need to be, or let units re-roll hit rolls of 1. There's some solid spells available, and you need to take at least one, so if nothing else, you might as well learn to love them. That sounds a lot more dismissive than I actually mean it, it's just that my first game was against dwarfs, and hurling spells at a dwarf is about as effective as hurling insults. Against an army that doesn't have inbuilt magic resistance, you're gonna be doing a lot better. Mortuary Priests are the lesser version and are either Wizardry level 1 or 2, with point costs respectively at 55 or 85. High Priests, meanwhile, are either level 3 or 4, at 140 or 170 points respectively, depending on how magical you want to be. Your Hierophant is the Lich Priest with the highest wizard level, or if there's multiple of the same level, you can pick. There's more to them than just magic spam, but we'll go over general army rules shortly, so we'll come back around to that. It's named character time. Starting small once again, Prince Apophis. He was a real asshole in life and committed a little bit of regicide, so he was sentenced to be eaten alive by scarabs. In death, he bargained with the god of death Usirian for his release from his otherwise eternal torment if he could find a soul of equal weight to his own. Usirian agreed, but just so happened to forget to tell Apophis that no two souls are of exactly equal weight. Now Apophis roams the land shanking people to find a soul equal to his, which will never happen even ignoring the end times. He's sure enough an assassin, able to single out a particular character of the other players to reroll all hit and wound rolls against, as well as count as having a magical weapon when he fights them. He has a breath weapon, which by the way is not technically breath, but instead him unhinging his jaw and beetles flying out to swarm all over the enemy. You obviously can't see it, but my entire body convulsed as I imagine what that looks like. Ugh. And when he dies, all enemy units within 2d6 inches of him suffer 2d6 strength 2 AP 1 hits, because he's bringing you with him to Assyrian if he has to go back. His stat line isn't the most phenomenal, with an astonishingly dogshit initiative 1 and only strength 4 and weapon skill 4, but if nothing else, you can always throw him at a wizard. He's got fly 9 and the ambusher special rule, and at 130 points, even if all he does is keep a wizard out of position with the threat of him killing them, I'd say he's done his job well enough. The next of the 3 special characters available is Nakaf, the emissary of Setra. For those of you not in the know, Setra's full list of titles takes 2 hours straight to read. Nakaf is the guy who reads that out. If you think that's all he can do, however, you're sorely mistaken, because he's probably of Norscan birth, and even before he became undead, he was suicidally loyal to Setra. If you dared to interrupt the reading of the most glorious of rulers' titles, Big S wouldn't even get the chance to order your execution. Nakaf would have already turned your head into crushed watermelon and returned to reading them out by the time Setra got the chance. He was already awake when Setra rose from his own tomb, and now in undeath he stands ready to deal death to those who would insult his lord with their unworthy presence. He's also pretty smart and persuasive when need be, since when Khalida refused to leave her post in Lamia, it was Nakaf who convinced Setra not to have her erased from history for the affront. Instead of continuing to read out stat lines, for a moment let me just be brutally honest with you. Nakaf's job is to beat the snot out of enemy champions. If you are looking at his stat line, you might be wary of that sentence, because in all honesty, it could be a bit better. However, the killing blow rule is a thing. Usually it means on a roll of a 6 to wound, you just kill the other guy. For Nakaf, this happens on a 5 or a 6, and to make it all the better, enemies can't refuse challenges he issues. He can't refuse any issue to him, but that's why he exists, so why would you? With 3 attacks, it's not the most likely thing to go off, but if you manage to insta-kill some keystone character your opponent has, you're gonna be on cloud 9 the rest of the match. Doesn't even matter if you still lose, you can just go, hey, nice job on the victory. Remember when my 120-point model beat your general to death in a single round of combat? If that sounds rather rude, consider that if you're playing the Tomb Kings and you don't have a bit of an ego, you need to find a different army. And last but absolutely not least, the man, the myth, the imperishable himself, Setra. He's a monster. At 445 points, he's nearly a quarter of your army. He has to be your general no matter what. And if you're running Tomb Kings, you don't need me to convince you to run Setra. The only reason you might not own him already is because he's constantly sold out, because everyone wants to own him. 7 weapon skill, 6 strength, 5 toughness, 8 wounds because of the Chariot of the Gods, initiative 3, 5 attacks, and 10 leadership. That's what peak performance really looks like. He's also a level 1 wizard, because remember, if he wasn't a wizard, then that would mean other people could do things that he couldn't. Not that he needs to be a wizard, of course, it's just the principle of the matter. He's got a 4-up armor save, a 5-up ward save, a 5-up regeneration save, and by God is he going to hurt you when he by himself causes 2d3 impact hits on the charge. And assuming you're fielding him as part of a royal host army, which you should of course be doing, he can join the units of chariots to lead. Run down your enemies. Show them who truly rules this world. Charge headfirst into that unit of Chaos Knights, or whatever the hardest hitting unit your opponent has to offer is. It doesn't matter what unit stats say. It doesn't matter what the most point cost efficient use for your units is and you're not doing it. They stand before you. They want you to kneel, to serve. And what does Setra not do, ladies and gentlemen? Serve. He rules. Anything he wounds suffers a -1 on their 2 hit rolls. I don't think he's physically capable of suffering wounds due to unstable like other undead, because he has Indomitable 3. The undead soldiers under his command stand back up not because he's magically repairing them, but because he's so egotistical and full of his own hype that it in turn brings them back by how much they believe in him, despite not having a personality anymore. Take Setra. If you can, just take Setra. And one important thing to remember, if you lose, don't worry about it. Setra once lost to some Norscan invaders, where the leader killed him and stole his crown and a bunch of treasure after both armies were basically destroyed to a man. When Setra and his forces respawned, he sailed from Egypt to Sweden to burn half of it to the ground just to get his stuff back. If you somehow lose even with mighty Setra on the tabletop, it just means your opponent has now forfeited both their life and the lives of everyone he knows at a later date. Now to vomit out other special rules. The positives only for now, as is tradition here. Arrows of Asaph are what make your skeleton archers better than absolute garbage. They never suffer any penalties to hit when shooting. just don't worry about it. It applies to Ushabti with bows too, which means we've somehow found a way to import Dark Souls hitboxes to a tabletop game. If a unit has the Khopesh rule, they have an automatic AP -1 on their strikes. Good stuff. Curse of the Necropolis isn't anything too special, but it does mean anyone who kills either your Monarchs or Lich Priest might take some damage for the trouble. Nehekaran Phalanx is an upgrade 1 unit per 1,000 points can take that means that they lose a combat encounter, they don't give ground as a result, unless the unit strength of the guys who beat them is double theirs. Give the ability to some Tomb Guard and you're golden. Indomitable means that if unstable happens and you're at risk of losing some wounds from a failed leadership test, you reduce how many wounds you take by whatever amount is shown next to the keyword. Nehekaran Undead means all units with this keyword have Fear, Immune to Psychology, Unbreakable, and Unstable. You also can't march a unit unless it has the Fly keyword, but if you're playing an undead army, you probably accepted you weren't going anywhere fast. Chariots notwithstanding. Although saying that, a surprising amount of the stuff in the roster isn't that slow, and has the Fly keyword. Also, as one related positive, you never need to worry about break tests. You're undead. Knowing how to retreat properly is for people who plan on retreating, which is not you, so who cares? Also, if you have the book to hand, you might notice how everything in it has a regeneration save. This is good. This is how your army doesn't fall apart. If you fail your armor save, and spoiler alert for the cons section, you will probably be doing that a lot, you get another one based on whatever the number next to the regeneration keyword is, usually 5 or 6. It's part of the mechanical implementation of Tomb King soldiers dying but coming back, rather than them outright regenerating. You killed the skeleton warrior, you cut off the arm of the Ushabti, but unfortunately for you, they made the regen save, so the warrior stood right back up and the Ushabti just reattached their arm. A Casket of Souls can double down on keeping your soldiers alive by giving them a ward save and giving enemies -1 to hit with a relatively reliable spell to cast, or if you're feeling malicious, it can force a leadership test to cause some damage. But their most important special rule is Arise. This, along with their regeneration save, is why your army can be insufferably hard to kill. When a Lich Priest or a Monarch with a fancy head is nearby, you can resurrect or heal nearby models. There's an order to who resurrects and gets healed first, and characters that join a unit don't get rezzed, but otherwise a Lich Priest nearby makes a leadership test and your models start coming back and or healing. Infantry and Swarms get D3 plus the Wizard's level of wounds back, regular Cavalry and War Beasts get the level +1, Monstrous Ivalry and Cavalry and Light Chariots get the Wizard's level worth of wounds back, and Heavy Chariots, Monstrous Creatures, Behemoths, and War Machines get 1 wound back. As you can see, you get the most bang for your buck by resurrecting an infantry blob, but resurrecting a chariot for another drive-by can be great, and even just giving a Sphinx back a wound isn't a bad option. Importantly, you can't do this if you're in combat, but given that it's the wizards who do this, you probably don't want them in combat anyways. You know who can do it in combat, though? Cetra. He can make an Arise test in combat, because such is his will that his forces will be coming back no matter what. His My Will Be Done test is also made for units within 6 inches of him, rather than just ones that he joined. Did you think just because I finished his little character section I was done talking about Cetra? Are you implying Mighty Cetra deserves only one measly section? Nikaf, take this person's genitals and hang them from the peak of the pyramid. But with the good comes the bad, few though the lore criticisms may be, so let's get through them quick as we can. The biggest lore downside is, of course, if you don't like ancient Egypt or the undead, this army isn't for you. If this is the case, then you are almost certainly a boring person I never want to speak to, but that is something to consider, I guess. They also come with the usual caveat of undead armies, and that most of your basic troops aren't exactly brimming with personality, but the kings themselves have more than enough to make up for it. A rather less arguable issue is that the Tomb Kings are a pretty stasis-locked faction. Advancing technologically or culturally isn't really anything they do. As proof, their army list here is more or less the same as it was in fantasy, which takes place hundreds of years after the old world. Similar to the Elven factions, this in-universe puts them on a bit of a clock. They can either conquer everything while they're still on an even playing field, or they're eventually going to be left behind in everything but magic once the Imperial equivalent of John Moses Browning is born. Another lore downside is that the Tomb Kings only have so many ways to get new recruits. They aren't really too into necromancy in the sense of raising zombies and other random corpses to help them fight, since that's Nagash's stick, and he didn't exactly impress them with his work. Sometimes the living will fight alongside them, and indeed serve under them, but that's also fairly rare. Outright killing a Tomb King is pretty hard since they respawn fairly easily, but there's only so many tombs left to open before you run out of pre-existing mummies and their skeletal followers to send into the meat grinder. Nagash's magic does seem to linger a bit, and sometimes newly dead in Nehekara will rise the same as the original inhabitants did, but that's an inconsistent at best way to get new soldiers. Other factions still have the ability to give birth, so while the Tomb Kings aren't lacking for numbers by any means, there's only so many of them to go around. To mirror an earlier point, the Tomb Kings don't really do small-scale things. The obvious thing from what I said earlier is that for every instance of a Tomb King ordering some sort of stealth mission or surgical strike, there's 10 instances of them ordering their enemies to be entirely unmade through overwhelming force. But for some horror for ya, it extends to their day-to-day life, too. There's no more drinking and eating, no more enjoying small pleasures like the sun on your face. Any sort of physical intimacy is gone, from the most lustful of acts to just holding your lover close at night. This downside is 2-in-1 and in the most horrifying of ways. You won't be doing small-scale army stuff, which can be a shame, but you also have no rest or relaxation or anything like that. Your army goes home from war to sit in vacant cities where maybe 5% of the people around them can form a coherent thought, while those who were once their subjects mill around, performing half-remembered acts from their lives out of instinct and nothing more. It's genuinely both saddening and terrifying to think about. It also, incidentally, means that the best way to inflict a leadership test on a Tomb King is to tell them they're now breathing manually and watch them have a panic attack. And the final lore downside that I care to cover in my never-ending favoritism is that if you decide to become a Tomb Kings player, you're going to have to suffer an endless amount of comments that boil down to people going, "Oh, so they're like the Necrons?" Now, legally, you should be allowed to do what Cetra does and use their skulls as catapult ammunition. But until that day comes, you're just gonna have to try to be patient and accept that Warhammer fans that only like 40k have to be educated on the idea that 40k is not the progenitor of every piece of media ever written. Now, for tabletop downsides. First off, those skeleton warriors I talked about. Regen saves make them surprisingly durable. Them being cheap as dirt means you can feasibly field 100 of them without destroying your army's economy. There's a reason for this, and that reason, as you can probably expect, is that they are absolute trash units. I don't mean they can't stand up to other factions' heavy hitters, I mean they get diffed by clan rats. You're gonna need to get yourself some mages to revive them, because if the regen save rolls aren't on your side, they're gonna start disappearing quickly. Even the Tomb Guard aren't phenomenal, it's just that at weapon skill 3, you forget they aren't the best thing ever because you're so used to weapon skill 2 on your default warriors. Speaking of though, flaming attacks are especially brutal against you because of 2 keywords the Tomb Kings have. Regeneration is 1. If a model with flaming attacks hits you, you don't get your regen save. That's it. But also, dry as dust. Not everything in your army has this keyword, but if it does, then keep that unit as far away from fire as possible. How it works is if a model with that keyword is wounded by a flaming attack, roll a d6. On a 1 through 3 you're fine, but on a 4 through 6 you take an extra wound. This is per wound caused by the flaming weapon, by the way, and not for the entire round of combat's worth of wounds, which is something that can really mess up your chariots or monarchs if you aren't careful. Their infantry are also slow to get anywhere. 4 inches isn't dwarf speed, but it's still slower than a lot of other units in the game. Now for just moving them up the board, I didn't find this to be too much of an issue, especially since the infantry are mostly just there to eat up space while the faster constructs and chariots do the real heavy lifting. But when you need to move your archers forward and don't have enough movement left to wheel them in direction you need them facing, that's when you're gonna feel the hurt. My will be done can of course mitigate this, but there's only so much that can be done to help them not be slow as shit. Now the infantry being bad isn't the worst thing ever because you have things like their constructs, but the flip side of them being scary is that they also have 3 big downsides to consider. One is just point costs. A Kemrian War Sphinx will be the example I'll use here. 175 points before any upgrades are given isn't horribly expensive, but if you want the 2 guys on top for example, that's another 10 points each. So fitting them into your army could become an issue, especially if you blew your load on Cetra and 500 chariots to go with them. The second issue is that the large target keyword means you're going to be eating every shot thrown at you. This of course includes artillery, all of which is going to be pointed at this thing if the enemy has them. And of course, if the enemy kills your big scary monsters, you're left with an anvil that doesn't have a hammer. I really hope your shitbird skeletons win the war of attrition if that happens, because otherwise it's going to be a very slow and disappointing loss for you from there on out. Even chariots aren't immune despite not being large targets, because a well-aimed cannon shot is going to boil through the entire formation of them. In fact, to briefly touch on that topic, your chariots are both cheap and core unit choices because they aren't the best chariots in the game. Tuskgore and Razorgore chariots, for example, are respectively almost double and almost triple a Tomb King chariot's point cost because they're just all around better. Taking them in units mean you can charge and absolutely obliterate an enemy if you roll well, but don't expect them to stick around too long if the charge doesn't wipe the enemy out on the first go. Easily the biggest downside though is how the Hierophant works. For those of you only familiar with Age of Sigmar Undead, you still know that leaders make or break the army. But in that game, it's a bit less literal. In the old world, if your Hierophant dies, then every turn your entire army needs to take a leadership test. If a unit fails it, they lose models and wounds based on how badly they failed it. If the Lich Priest you chose to be your Hierophant dies, and you need to have one, you're in deep shit. If it happens at the last turn of the game and it's been a decisive win for you up to that point, might not be the end of the world. If it happens off rip because you did some poor placement and the enemy got a lucky cannon shot off, just forfeit. It'll be quicker than suffering through the rest of your match. It's also disappointing to see that some characters like Khalida didn't return. With other armies it makes some sense even if I'd still like the rules to be present, because especially for humans, the characters just weren't born yet. But the Tomb Kings are immortal mummies. They aren't going anywhere. I know they exist because fantasy is later in the timeline than Old World. But I can't play Khalida, which is a shame because I want my Tomb Kings archers to all have poison attacks that can never have their hit roll modified. It's disappointing from both the lore and from the mechanics, so here's hoping some future releases fix this issue. Your ally's situation is also pretty disappointing across the board. All of the options you have are suspicious, which means leadership can become an issue if they get too close to each other, and you can only ally with Greenskins, Chaos, and Beastmen. This is especially galling for the Tomb Kings because they aren't pure evil. They're all over the place, but taken as a whole, the faction is true neutral. There's lore of Settra burning down half of Norska, like I mentioned, as well as the High Elves and Tomb Kings working together against a force of demons. But in the old world, it's bad guys only for you, and they don't even gel that well together because of suspicious, which much like the previous downside is a letdown both mechanically and narratively. And for the last two tabletop issues they have, the models and real-world pricing. I like old fantasy sculpts. I like the standard Tomb King warriors. I think they're quaint in a charming way. But if your standards are Age of Sigmar zombies and skeletons, there's decent odds you're going to be disappointed. Also, and may Petra forgive me for this, putting Settra's model together is hell. Him and the chariot are metal. Not great, but workable. The horses are plastic. All fine there. Making the chariot bit that connects the horses to the chariot actually stick has made me want to cry putting it together. It just refuses to stay glued. Clearly, I am unworthy of using the Kemrikara on the tabletop, and there's decent odds you will be too. As for pricing, did you think an army with a basic infantry unit that has a point cost of 4 per model was going to be cheap to collect? No, it isn't. You're going to be shelling out some big bucks on the Tomb Kings. You can mitigate this by focusing on chariots and constructs, which isn't a terrible idea to begin with, but even still, you're going to be buying a lot of minis to make a full Tomb Kings army. Even if you squeeze in every upgrade you can to bump up point costs as high as you can get them to go, Settra's still going to be asking you to break open your savings account. And that was the Tomb Kings. March 4th, child of Nehekara, and show the Warhammer world who truly rules it. I love them, you should love them, and with this army, show the world that sometimes things really were just better in the olden days. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the chariots to my Tomb Kings, the hard-hitting force keeping me going through these constant days of warfare. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching, and take care out there. She tomb on my king till I Nehekara. She Neferata on my Khalida till I Wasoran. She Nagash on my Arkan till I Vlad. She Settra on my The till I Imperishable. I'm having a stroke? I should stop writing at 4 in the morning? I'm not deleting this as the end of video bit? I want all of you to suffer too?